to the Corinthian church here. He's saying to them, look, I want you to know that all that I'm going through so that you will benefit. I want you to know that everything that I'm going through is not in vain. I believe that God is with me in the midst of what I'm going through, and I believe that God will be with you also in the midst of what you're going through. I like to meet up with you. I like to be with you. But I want to share this with you, and I want you to understand that what we're going through together is something that we have to look at in a particular perspective. How do we look at, how do we deal with what it is that we're going through, the hardships that we're going through? And he shares in this particular text a phrase, a formula, if you will, as to how to deal and how to put into perspective our experiences. He says here in verse 18, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. Let me say that again. Paul says, this is how I'm dealing with my situation. This is how I'm dealing with my circumstance, how I'm dealing with my trials and tribulations. I am not looking at what can be seen, but I am looking at what cannot be seen. Now, what cannot be seen? He is not talking here about something that we absolutely cannot see. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying it is impossible to see it. It certainly is possible, but what he's saying is that the way that we normally look at something, if we look at it that way, we can't see it. There are certain things that we cannot see if we look at it normally, if we look at it in a certain way. We have to look at it in a particular way. Now, let me just back up. Some things we can't see with the naked eye. I mean, now, some things some of us can't see even if it's right in front of us, because of the eyes that we have, But the naked eye can't see some things. I was listening to WHYY, the astronomer from Franklin Institute. I don't know if anybody knows who he is. His name is slipping me now, but he's a black guy.
Derek, yeah. Black guy from North Philly. I'm sure I said that so Brian can understand what I'm talking about. Okay, but he is the astronomer, has risen to the position of astronomer at Franklin Institute. They were interviewing him and another lady who had written a book, and they were talking about the new discoveries that's happening rapidly. How we are discovering new planets, and we are discovering new stars, and they were talking about the fact that there are literally, and I don't know what number they use, but hundreds of thousands or millions, but there are literally so many things out there that we can't see. And the truth of the matter is that there's probably more out there that we can't see than we're actually seeing. And that these things that they're discovering so many of them, and they're only focusing on one small part of the universe. In other words, they have kind of focused their attention on one part, and this one part, they're discovering so many different things that we did not see and we did not know before. So there's some things that we cannot see with the naked eye. But Paul is not even talking about the naked eye here. When he says that we look at things that we cannot see, he is not talking about cannot see with the naked eye, that we need a binocular, that we need some kind of powerful telescope to see it. He's talking about from a physical versus spiritual perspective. There are some things that we cannot see because we're not looking at it from a spiritual perspective. So Paul says, look, I am going to look at these things through my spiritual eyes. I'm going to look at it so that this is what's going to keep me going on. This is what's going to enable me to continue to be the minister that God would have me to be. Because I am looking at it from a spiritual perspective. And he goes and he quotes Psalm 116 verse 10. Now, when he quotes Psalm 116 verse 10, he is saying here, Psalm 116 verse 10, let me read what it says to you. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. This is the psalmist writing. The psalmist finds himself in dire situation. He finds himself where death is surrounding him and Sheol is holding on to him. He finds himself where he is crying and he is stumbling. And he says this in verse 10, I kept my faith even when I said I am greatly afflicted. In other words, what the psalmist is saying here is that in spite of everything that's going on around me, in spite of the fact that I'm weeping, in spite of the fact that I'm stumbling, in spite of the fact that death is at my door, I believe. I am keeping my faith even though I know that I am being afflicted. So Paul says, look here. When I look through the eyes, the spiritual eyes, the eyes of faith, what I am seeing is what the psalmist saw. And what I am seeing is that I am understanding that I am able to overcome because I am seeing things through the eyes of faith. He uses the phrase, the spirit of faith, the confession of faith. I believe. When we believe, then we know. And there are two things that he says that we come to know in chapter 4, verse 14, and chapter 5, verse 1. We know when we look through the eyes of faith, we come to realize that even though death is in front of us, what the eyes of faith allows us to see is resurrection. When we look through the eyes of faith, physical eyes will see that we are torn apart. But the spiritual eye will see that we are put together. Physical eyes will see death and destruction, but spiritual eyes will see resurrection and restoration. Paul is saying here, look, we have got to look through the eyes of faith to see what cannot be seen through the physical eyes. Now, when we look through the eyes of faith, what do we see? When we look through the eyes of faith, what do we see? Verses 16, 17, and 18. I just want to point your attention to that very quickly. When we look through the eyes of faith, we see three things. One is, when we look through the eyes of faith, is that we see that our internal person is being renewed. Physically, we may be falling apart. Physically, we are growing old. Physically, we are growing weak and weary. Physically, we are in harm, we are in hurt, we are in pain. Physically, things are not looking too great. But when we look through the eyes of faith, when we look through the spiritual eyes, when we look through the Spirit of God, what we see is that we see the inner person being renewed. What we see is the inner person being strengthened. What we see is the inner person being drawn close to God. You know, it is quite possible that we can draw close to God in the midst of our illnesses. It is quite possible that we find more power than we have ever dreamed when we find ourselves in circumstances and situations that render us weak.
God was silent, and then God responded and said, look here, Paul, you got to understand that I have given that to you. For you to understand that when you are weak, that I am strong.
Yes.
Paul says, we have this treasure in earthen vessels. Why? So that God will receive the glory. Don't you understand that God gets glory out of our illnesses? Don't you understand that God gets glory even when we are weak? While we are broken, while we are torn, while we are deteriorating. I know, there are times when we, if you listen to some Christians, you listen to some ministers, we will never grow old. We will never get sick. You got ministers out there trying to tell you, if you get sick, something's wrong with you. Your faith is weak somehow. That somehow Christianity has cornered the fountain of youth. We can't get old. Folk out there thinking, that this life, we're trying to be in this life. But Paul is saying, look, while the outer man is falling apart, and then, that's going to happen. We get reminded quite often that we're getting older. When I get letters from AARP, all of a sudden I get a letter from AARP and my name is on it. I'm trying to figure out why am I getting this letter? When the government sends me, they send me a little thing there, and it tells me about my pension or my, what is that? Social Security. Social Security writes me and Social Security stuff. I'm trying to figure out why is Social Security writing me, and then I check my age and I realize, hello, you're getting close to 50. You know what I mean? But while I am getting older, and while things are, you get up out of the bed and all of a sudden, you get up like you normally get up, but now all of a sudden things start happening. You didn't do anything. You just got up out of the bed and your leg starts hurting you and it hurts you all day long and you can't do anything about it until it goes away. You realize that your body is falling apart. But thanks be to God, when you're looking through the eyes of faith, what you're seeing is that inner man, that spiritual man, the inside of you is growing stronger. Oh, deeper, the songwriter says, yet I pray. And higher every day, and wiser, blessed Lord. In thy precious holy word, I am drawing closer to him. I'm understanding more. My walk is getting higher and wiser. My knowledge is becoming and expanding in him because he is good to me. He has blessed me. He has brought me thus far by faith. He has kept me. He has delivered me. He has provided for me. When you look through the eyes of faith, when you look at what cannot be seen with the physical eyes, what you are seeing is the inner person being renewed. The inner person being energized. The inner person giving God praise. I mean, there are times, those of us who have visited people in the hospital or visited people sick, quite often we go and we visit them and we go there to cheer them up and we leave being cheered up ourselves. You know why? Because that person's inner person has been renewed. They've been able to spend some time with God. They've been able to reflect. They've been able to see things in a particular perspective. And that inner man, that inner person has been strengthened.